Of course, overflying the village is an absolute no-no. It's an avoid area. So pilots have the choice either to go around the back of it, as we see the Spitfire doing, or if they're able to turn inside the village. And there's Spitfire Nh341 of Aero Legends rolling out on the hard runway, and he's been told to stay on the hard runway while we get our next act into the air from the grass. A depiction of a traditional First World War style aerial melee that really does conjure up, as far as is possible in the modern era, something of what air combat was like during the Great War. So now the team out on the horizon, diving in towards us as we go back to the aerial action above the battlefields of the First World War and the 2021 presentation by the Great War Display Team. The defences opening straight up against them. Three pairs of aircraft diving towards the trenches. One of the Royal Aircraft Factory SE-5As and the only monoplane in the display, the Juncker Cl-1. Off to our left, we've got the Sopwith triplane and one of the two Fokker DR1 Dreideckers, the Fokker triplanes. And out to the right, the other SE-5A and Fokker DR1. Don't forget that aircraft of this era were fashioned largely solely from wooden fabric. They've been designed with a rudimentary, by modern standards, though for the time obviously very impressive, level of knowledge of aerodynamics. And these, as I said, are more modern replicas using more modern engines. But at the time, their engines would often have been unreliable. And let's not forget, Colin, how inexperienced the pilots were as well.
Absolutely. The pilots were young men, and I mean, like, we're talking 19, 20 years old. That's always the case. We send young men to war. That's been history. The other thing to remember as we watch this, as we get drowned out by machine guns and bombs, as we watch this, back in the day, the pilots of these type of aeroplanes would not have parachutes.
They wouldn't have oxygen on board either, and yet they were fighting at some altitude.
Yes, they were. And the number of aeroplanes in the sky at any one time, you know, there would be huge numbers taking part in what you described quite correctly as this aerial melee. There would be just endless aeroplanes, and it doesn't bear thinking about.
Yes, nowadays we talk about beyond visual range combat. The modern day fighters like the Eurofighter Typhoon and the F-35 Lightning II and so forth, all intended largely to undertake aerial combat out of the pilot's own range. This is the polar opposite.
Yes.
This is hand-to-hand aerial combat, pretty much.
And aerial combats that began when these aeroplanes were, well, not these particular aeroplanes, but aeroplanes were used for reconnaissance purposes, and then the pilots started to shoot at each other with shotguns and revolvers, and from there it was just a short step to when the aeroplanes themselves would carry machine guns. Initially the guns would be mounted on the top wing, and then the interrupter gear would be introduced, enabling the guns to actually be positioned in front of the pilots, and the interrupter gear meant that they could actually shoot through the propeller.
Now, today we refer to these aircraft as fighter aircraft. That term wasn't so much in use at the time. They would be known as fighting scouts. And the SE-5A, of which we see two of them, one of them smoking earlier on in the display, having taken a hit. In that aircraft designation, the SE stands for Scout Experimental. It's one of those aircraft you can see high above us in the centre of the display, with a Fokker triplane trying to get on its tail as the Sopwith triplane lower down smokes with a Fokker in pursuit. The SE-5A was used during the war by 21 British or Empire squadrons and 2 American units. More than 5,000 were built. Many of the great aces, the likes of Albert Ball and Mick Mannock, flew these aeroplanes. These are actually 7/8 scale replicas, the 2 SE-5As in the display. They represent an aircraft that was a good performer at all altitudes, faster than its German rivals, with an excellent rate of climb and a strong and agile airframe. Now the Sopwith triplane heads back in just in front of the tower, with one of its Fokker counterparts very, very close in behind. And it's fascinating to these two. The Sopwith triplane entered service with the Royal Naval Air Service in 1917. Its service was quite brief, but it was very influential. Its rates of climb and turn were better than those of its enemy contemporaries. And the famous Black Flight of number 10 Naval Squadron scored 87 German kills in just 3 months with its tripounds, as they were known. And the Fokker triplane, the DR-1, the Dreidecker, was conceived in significant part as a result of the excellent performance of its Sopwith cousin. German fighters of the First World War, the Fokker DR-1 is by far the best known, thanks to the exploits of the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen in particular, and we can see Paul Ford's replica triplane in the static display here, painted as one of von Richthofen's mounts. However, they were built in very, very small numbers for the time. Just 320 DR-1s were turned out. They suffered serious structural problems, and that meant that the Imperial German Air Service decided to bring the Fokker D7 biplane into service in greater numbers to succeed it. The only monoplane in the display is the Juncker Cl-1. It's a replica of a monoplane ground attack aircraft, which had only been delivered to the tune of 47 examples by the time of the armistice in November 1918, but it was the most effective German ground attack platform of the late war period. This is one of two Bauer's Flybaby light aeroplanes that were converted into CL-1 lookalikes, complete with dummy rear gunner, by the late John Day, much missed member of the team. The Sopwith triplane is able to carry on flying, Colin, having taken this much punishment and having been smoking for virtually the whole display. I don't know.
It brings a whole new meaning to endurance, doesn't it?
Yes.
It's worth mentioning as well, you referred to the Red Baron. Well, of course, his demise was brought about, well, we believe anyway, his demise was brought about by being shot down from the ground, from ground fire. Heaven knows how he managed to avoid being shot down by aeroplanes, you know, in the kind of career that he had.
Yes, it had been thought he'd been shot down by a Sopwith Camel, built by the Clayton and Shuttleworth firm, which built Camels and triplanes in great numbers. The engineering firm set up by Joseph Shuttleworth, ancestor of Richard Shuttleworth, who founded the Shuttleworth collection. Crossover by Sopwith and Fokker triplanes at show centre.
We should also reflect on the fact that aviation really was in its infancy. It was only like a decade or so that aeroplanes were first used with controls and such like, and then 10 years or so later you've got this kind of thing going on.
Yes, indeed, this display, as always, showing us a little of what it was like in the air during the 1914-18 war. Final flypast coming up, and with this we pay tribute to the aviators of all countries who took part in that conflict. Dave Linney and Matthew Boddington in the two SE5As, which are just coming into land. They're followed by the Junkers Cl-1. With Will Greenwood at the helm. We've had Will here in the past in his Yak 3, which he used to own. Now back as part of the Great War display team. The Sopwith triplane next up. In the hands of the team leader, Gordon Brander. One of the two Dreideckers has left for home off slot, so only one of them coming in to land with us. You can see the one that is landing just angling off slightly across the grass. The two Fokkers flown in the sequence today by Mike Collett and Peter Bond. Our thanks to them, some of the members of the 2021 Great War display team. We saw a Spitfire getting into the air